The United States has not yet turned 250 years old yet. She will in 3 years. And yet in her short history, being a Protestant nation in its founding, it has produced quite a number of saints already. Now, I dare say most of them were from New York. We have St. Isaac Job, Rene Goupil, and John Lalande, who were martyred in upstate New York. And then we also have Kitiri Tekakwitha, who was born in upstate New York but died in Canada. And then, of course, we have Mother Cabrini, who passed away in New York, founding her sister's community, and Marianne Cope in Buffalo. But we also have Sloanus Casey over in Detroit, who started his miracles in New York, but he's from Detroit. And then we also have Stanley Rutherford, who's over from Oklahoma, which is a 5-hour drive from here to his birthplace of birth. And then in Philadelphia, we have St. John Newman and Catherine Drexel, and St. John Newman will celebrate later in the week. And so we have this incredible amount of saints in the United States. Sorry, none of them were from Ohio, even passed through Ohio, even cared about Ohio, or knew that Ohio even existed, as far as I know. But anyway, that's not important right now. The importance is that we have this incredible amount of saints and holiness that came from a nation that was predominantly Protestant in its foundation and in its short years. And they're pretty powerful saints. And today we celebrate one of those saints. And interesting for her, this particular saint we celebrate today, she began life in England, like most of our Americans, founding fathers. She begins life in England before the birth of the country. We know the country was born in 1776. She's born in 1774, and she's not Catholic. She begins her life in 1774 in England. Elizabeth Anne, I forget her original last name, but she marries a fellow William Seton when she's 19 years old. And immediately they start having kids. You know, they're Episcopalian, they have 5 children, but a lot of suffering. The husband was very, very sick. And so they were only a few years married when they went to Italy, because I think it was for husband's either business or because he was sick, one of the two, for treatment. When he died there in 1805, they were in a short marriage. The marriage was only 9 years, and in those 9 years they had 5 kids. And Elizabeth, while she was in Italy, she began to discover Catholicism and the beauty of Catholicism, and that's where Elizabeth became Catholic, because of the intensity of the beauty of the faith that she witnessed while in Italy. I forgot what brought her to America. I can't remember all the details of her life. I apologize. I should, considering she's becomes a fellow New Yorker as she comes to New York. And she lives on the lower side of Manhattan, which is where most of it was. People think of Manhattan, they think downtown, they think Rockefeller Center and so forth. That was all wilderness back then. You know, where St. Patrick's Cathedral is, that whole block was owned by the Trappist monks. They were going to build a monastery there and decided to give it to the Archdiocese of New York. And people thought the Archdiocese was crazy for building the cathedral there because it was in the middle of nowhere. It became the center of Manhattan. Now it's downtown, midtown. But back then it was nowhere. So she moves to New York, and while she's there, not only is she growing in her Catholic faith and developing in her faith, but she's only Catholic for about 3 years. Her children are still very young. Her oldest can't be more than 11 years old when she decides that she's going to found a school. And so she founds a school in 1808, and it's the first Catholic school, and it's doing rather well. And this time, you gotta remember, this is the very early 1800s, and so 1805, 1806, 1808 is when she founded her first school. So the United States is very, very young. There's no education system really at work. But she gets to work on it, and she starts a school. Then she moves down to Emmitsburg, Maryland. She goes around Ohio. She doesn't go through Ohio. She gets to Emmitsburg, and there, not only does she found another school, but she feels inspired now to begin a religious life. Now, this is really odd that she's starting a religious community as a widow, but not so much as a widow, that she still has 5 young children with her as she starts this religious order of teaching sisters. And so she's a widow, a mother, a foundress, a superior, and also teaching. And so she is really a type A personality, do it all, but very much inspired by God to do this work. And her order grows incredibly fast. And the sisters begin to establish schools throughout the country. She is one of the foundresses of the Catholic school system in the United States, along with Mother Cabrini, another New Yorker, and Catherine Drexel. These become the three basically main saintly women who really give to the Church in the United States an incredible Catholic school system. Eventually, it'll be really very much organized and promoted by the saint we celebrate on, is it tomorrow? Tomorrow. St. John Newman, Philadelphian. He also avoided Ohio. But anyway, he's, another great, incredible saint to promote the education system. As she founds this religious community, she has all these schools that she started, and during these years, she loses 2 of her own children to tuberculosis. One of her daughters dies in 1812, the other one dies in 1816. So she's a woman who knew suffering. She lost her husband when she was very young. She was only 26 when her husband died. And now she loses 2 of her children before she's even 40. This poor woman suffers very much as she is working so hard for the church and for the Lord. But the Lord continues to bless her, particularly in her deep prayer life. She sought always to do the will of God in her life. She dies in 1821 when she's only 47 years old. All of us here are older than her when she died. And we haven't accomplished a third or 10th or a 100th of what this woman did in she was Catholic for less than, she became Catholic in 1808, so you figure the math. No, 1806, 1805 she becomes Catholic, so figure the math out. In less than 20 years, she does this incredible work of founding this incredible community, the school system, and so forth. Her youngest child wasn't more than 20, I can't do math this morning, not I can ever do math, but anyway, her kids were still young. She barely saw them into their adulthood when she passed away. We know in the Office of Readings today we have a little beautiful writing of hers, and she speaks about doing the will of God, how important it is to do the will of God. She said the first duty that we have is to do the will of God. That's our first work, to do the will of God. Everything else in our life follows after that. The first thing is to do God's will, right? What does Jesus say of himself? I've come to do the Father's will. Well, have we come to do the Father's will? Or have I come to do my own will? Sometimes it's hard for me to distinguish what's God's will from my will, which is why she speaks about the virtue of obedience. It's very hard for older people to enter religious life or to return to religious life because of obedience. When we get set in our own will, we don't want to receive obedience. We think that the way we do things, how we do things, whether it be our particular way of doing things around the house or a particular way of apostolate, is the way of God, and yet we don't want to subject that to obedience, and so it's hard to accept it. But she's like, the first work is to do the will of God. Second is to do the will of God in the manner He wills it. To do it the way He wants it, not the way we want it. And again, she trusts that to the grace of obedience, right? If I want to do God's will, well, I'm free then in obedience to do His will, and the manner in which God wants it done. I have to do it the way God wants it, not my way, but His way. What's the theme song to hell? I did it my way. Right? It's not doing it but God's way. And she brings up a couple of examples. She's like, about we don't do work hurriedly and rushingly, like someone's got a whip to our back. And yet at the same time, we don't do it slothfully, dragging our feet. We do it diligently, carefully. We do it with honor. We do it with respect. We do His work with reverence. Whether that's some great apostolic work, some great ministry of preaching or teaching or this or healthcare, or if it's something as simple as cleaning the bathrooms. One time, Mother Teresa came in to see the sisters, and she visited this one convent, and she sat at a table and said, some of the sisters here truly, truly love Jesus very, very much. And they said, how do you do that, Mother? She says, because the bathrooms are so clean. Right? Because they diligently and carefully cleaned, and they did it with diligence, with care, with attention, and they did it for the love of Jesus. So doing the will of God, doing God's will in the manner in which he wills. And third, she says, is doing it because it's God's will. Right? I'm not doing it to honor other people. I'm not doing it to pat myself on the back. I'm not doing it because I want to feel respected and honored or feel good about what I'm doing. I do it because it's God's will. Most things God wills for us and asks us to do doesn't feel good, because normally he's calling us to the cross. He's calling us to death to self. He's calling us to surrender our will to do his will. And that is oftentimes very, very painful. So she says, first duty to do God's will. Second duty to do God's will in the manner in which he wills it. And third, to do it because it's his will. And then she gives, and I'll close with these little things here. What's necessary first and foremost is perseverance. We can't be a weed swaying in the wind. Yes, Lord, today. No, Lord, tomorrow. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow. We have to stick and persevere to what God has called us. Secondly, we have to rely on faith for strength. We have to rely on faith. When we start wavering, we become doubtful, we become worrying, we get distracted. We have to go back to that faith and find our strength in faith. And she said we have to have courage. Courage to keep an attentive watch, a continual watch. The evil one is always trying to take us away from God's will. The evil one is always trying to do God's will in the manner that we want to do it, not the way he wants us to do it. Then that way he can distract us from actually accomplishing God's will to the full. And he wants us to start doing it for ourselves. Because we like the adulation, because we like the fact that we're important, or we like the fact that people, it makes us feel good. Those become traps and snares of the evil one to get us focused on ourselves and not on God's will and love of God. So she said you need courage to keep continual watch. Perseverance, relying on faith, courage to keep continual watch. Third, she says, be above the vain fears of nature and efforts of your enemy. So be above the vain fear of nature. Right? What's the fear of our own nature? Well, the fear that I'm not going to be strong enough. This is going to be too difficult. I'm too weak for this. Those are vain fears, because God's grace supplies. Oh, I'll lose too much sleep. Oh, this might be tough. Oh, this might cause physical pain to me. This will cause discomfort. Those are vain fears, because it's putting the trust in the here and now and not to the eternal reward that we will receive. And she also says not to be a fear of the enemy, of the efforts of the enemy. Don't be afraid of what Satan is going to try to do to you. God will protect you, and the Satan will only be allowed to do what God lets him do. This happened to St. Francis when he was getting beaten up by a demon one time. He said, and he wasn't allowing to affect him. The demons were getting frustrated. He says, you can only do what God permits you to do, so go for it. Do what you want on you, because you'll only be able to do what God lets you do. So don't be afraid, she says, even of the efforts of the enemy to destroy you, because they can only do what God permits them to do. And then she says in the end, keep always in mind the immortal crown that awaits you. Keep in mind the immortal crown that awaits you. The unfading crown of glory, as St. Paul says. We work so hard for the glories of this world. St. Paul calls those little leaf crowns we used to get when the champions won a race. They wither and fade. Even the golden crowns of this world wither and fade. Even the wonderful trophies and awards of this world all will burn on the last day and melt. The one thing that endures, that the Lord gives us, is that immortal crown of glory. And so to keep that ever in mind, to persevere, because you know you're going to receive that crown of glory. To rely on your faith and not on your own strength, because that crown of glory awaits you, and God wants you to have that crown. To have courage, to be continual watch, so that you don't lose that crown of glory. And not to be afraid of the vain things of nature, because your mortal body will be given back to you glorious. So waste it now in this world, because you're going to get a better one in the next to come. And don't be afraid of that enemy, because the Lord wants you to receive the crown of glory. How to receive that crown of glory? By doing the will of God. How do we receive the crown of glory? by doing the will of God in the manner in which God wills it. How do I receive the crown of glory? By doing the will of God in the manner which God wills it, because it is his will. To sum it up, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. May Saint Elizabeth Anne Seton intercede for us, that we may do the will of God as he wills it, because he wills it, with perseverance, with faith, with courage, without fear, seeking always that immortal crown. May God bless you, and may he keep you.